Good evening. Here we are here to discuss an interesting book by Sri Rajiv Malhotra ji, AI and the Future of Power, the Five Battlegrounds. He is from Infinity Foundation and he has written interesting books like Being Different, which had a profound impact on me. I'd like to welcome the panelists. First, I will mention Professor M. Vidyasagar, who is a fellow of the Royal Society FRS. He is a distinguished professor at IIT Hyderabad in electrical engineering. In the past, he was also for a decade at Concordia, at Waterloo for another decade, and he was also the first and the critical director for Center for AI and Robotics in Bangalore. He also for a decade he was at TCS, and most recently he was at UT Dallas. Now he's in IIT Hyderabad. Second, I would like to invite Professor P.R. Kumar, who is a University Distinguished Chair and Regents Professor at University of Texas College Station. He was previously at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a very distinguished body in the US for scientists and technologists. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Shailesh Kumar, who is the Chief Data Scientist at Reliance Jio, and he is also part of the Center of Excellence in AI and ML. Interestingly, he's also a visiting professor of machine learning at Indian School of Business, one of the top business schools, not only in India, also across the world. What's interesting also about Dr. Shailesh Kumar is that he has worked in many AI-related areas before his stints at Yahoo, Microsoft, Google. I am K. Gopinath. I'm a professor at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. So basically, the format is as follows. We'll take some important issues highlighted in the book and ask some related questions. Before we proceed to the discussion, I would like to request Rajiv ji to give a brief synopsis of the book.
Thank you, Gopinath, for organizing this discussion among esteemed panelists. And I want to thank each of you, Vidya Sagar ji, Shailesh ji, Professor Kumar ji, all of you, taking time from your busy schedules to discuss what I think is a very important topic. To give you my thesis in a nutshell, so that you can then quiz me, cross-examine me, grill me as much as you want, the more the better. Basically, what I want to say is artificial intelligence has a lot of positive things to do, positive things to offer to this world, no doubt. And a lot is being written on it. But there are also unequal impact of AI. Unequal in the sense that some people will get amazing new jobs, some people will lose jobs. They will not be trainable because maybe they'll be in the middle of their career or they're just not educated enough. Some regions of a country, maybe Bangalore will benefit, and some regions like Bihar and Odisha, the kind of industry, the kind of occupations they have will lose. So it'll be at the individual level, there'll be winners and losers. It'll be at the regional level. It may also trigger new colonization in the sense that China may colonize Pakistan. It already probably has. And, many African countries like Zimbabwe, where China has put a whole lot of monitors, whole lot of, sensors, these facial recognition cameras and all that, doing surveillance. And in the name of surveillance and security, they're actually capturing big data and able to control those governments. US may have its colonies or pseudo colonies. So similarly, so there may be a new era of colonization or semi-colonization, certainly because the impact is unequal at these different levels. The equilibriums that exist at various levels will fall apart. Because when you have an equilibrium among many forces held in balance, if the balance is upset because some forces get stronger than others because of new technology and their different ways, or their different ability to harness the technology, some have more access to it, some can afford it, some know more about it than others. So this kind of set of equilibriums at various levels fall apart. My thesis says that the unequal use of AI, the unequal impact of AI at the personal level, at the geographical regional level, at the national level, at the industry level, will create new haves and have-nots and will create disequilibrium. These existing equilibriums will fall apart. Of course, this has happened many times before, and eventually, maybe 25 or 50 years afterwards, there'll be a new equilibrium. a new kind of new rules of the game. But my work is on that interim period when the current equilibrium falls apart, which it already is. And before a new equilibrium is established, we will have a period of social unrest. It could be violent. There could be human rights violations. There could be trauma. There could be new political upheavals. So there can be all sorts of things happening because of this equilibrium. So this is part one of my thesis. Part two is that the analog with the industrial revolution is not valid, because while people say that, okay, in the case of industrial revolution, similar to the AI, a new technology of electrifying factories happened and the world benefited. More jobs were created than destroyed. My rebuttal to that is that while more jobs were created in Britain, jobs in India were lost. So India lost the old technology economy, and Britain gained the benefit of the Industrial Revolution. And this led to the rise of the East India Company. And this led to 200 years of colonialism. So actually, what happened in the Industrial Revolution supports my thesis, that there'll be unequal impact, as happened in the case of in that era. Also, another difference is this one is a similarity between the Industrial Revolution and what is happening in the AI revolution. But there are some dissimilarities also. In the Industrial Revolution, the adoption of new technology was very slow. So that if I was a 35-year-old farmer, it's not going to disrupt my job. The new technology meant it was so slow that I could continue being a farmer till I retired. And my son would not be a farmer. He would go to the city, get a factory job. So the transfer from farming to factories happened over 25, 30, 50 years slowly. And so one generation could continue living the old way, and the next generation could start in the new way. This did not happen right in the middle of some people's lives. AI is very abrupt because it's very quick. The adoption rates are fast. If you look at new technologies today versus, say, the adoption rate of electricity in the past, or automobiles, or the penetration of airplanes, those technologies took a very long time to get adopted. Capital was not as much available as it is today. There weren't that much communication around the world for people to learn quickly from each other. The scalability was very slow. So the scalability, the speed of AI adoption being what it is, we don't have the same case as the previous industrial revolution to gradually adjust to the new reality. This is another reason why the social impact right now will be far greater. So this is my second thesis, that it's different from the industrial revolution. The third part of my point is that the reports on India, AI in India, I've read pretty much everything I could get my hands on, whether it's Niti Aayog or FICCI or Price Waterhouse or McKinsey or whatever. The reports are not balanced. They represent the corporate sector. They represent the top-down, corporate sector. But corporate sector in India employs less than 10% of the workers. The other 90% are small, medium industries or self-employed. So these people who work for the corporate sector, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, all of these guys. Obviously they are presenting a corporate view. So they went and interviewed HR departments, they went and interviewed customer departments, PR people in corporate India, and they came up with various points of view. I kind of contest some of those claims, because to have a better report, more authentic report, they should go down to the panchayat level, they should go down to the district level. The impact at the state level has to be studied, because every state should look at the impact of AI for itself from the ground up. And also the tendency to use Western data, Western conclusions, and apply them blindly to India is going on. I see a lot of corporate presentations, a lot of government of India presentations, basically mimicking what the Westerners are saying about impact of AI. But the impact of AI will be very country specific and in fact state specific and industry specific. I don't see that. I don't see reports which have actually looked at AI bottom up. So those are some of my important views in this book. I will now stop and let the moderator take it forward.
So let me start with the first question, which Rajivji already has talked about. What will happen when AI makes large numbers of workers obsolete? The generic view is that most reports claim that AI will create more jobs than it will kill. But Rajivji's position is exactly the opposite. And he has explained why. Let me ask India-specific question. AI is generally said to have a big impact on workers with middle-level expertise. For example, middle-level managers are typically expected to be automated out. So, if so, will Indian technical workers who are not occupying the very high or the low end be a major casualty in global terms? Can I request Rajiv to uh, say a few words about this?
So, I'm glad you asked this question because when you ask people in India, what's the AI opportunity for the Indian workers? There are two issues I have. One is that the impact of AI is being seen only for those who are going to be in the AI business. People who are trained in AI, a lot of young people taking courses in AI. It's very popular in colleges and going down to schools also. But you're not going to be able to get 100% or even 50% or even 80% of the population, 25% of the population trained as AI producers. It'll be a small percentage of the population who are, kind of in the AI profession. So the issue of AI impact should also be discussed with non-AI people. The local street vendor who loses out to Amazon or to some big store, and they have all this machine learning and data knowledge to target deliveries and to target better supply chains and so on. So what happens to the when you make things efficient, anything you make efficient, and you remove inefficiencies, you're also removing jobs of people, because while it was inefficient in a macro sense, in a micro sense, individual jobs depended on it. So that kind of impact for people who are not well educated, the bottom 500 million people, I think that's a concern, has not been addressed. Even among those who are going to be trained, I think more to the point of what Gopinath is asking, even those who are going to be AI trained, the goal of the Indian thinkers is to supply labor to Western clients, which means body shopping, which means wage arbitrage. We'll supply labor, and they will build intellectual property for American companies and British companies and European companies in general. China is being sort of blocked out. It used to be doing this also in a big way in India, but supplying Indian brains so that foreign companies can get the intellectual property is hardly a long-term viable strategy, because it means that we are just a bunch of labor producers. We are just labor, and somebody else owns the brain, owns the property that we produce. So I find that even among the middle level people, the plan of using them as labor is, I find it kind of problematic.
Yes, yes. So it's an honor to be here, sir. And this is a great and very important discussion. Um, so I will play both sides of it, and talk about how we cannot brush a technology only in one way. And there are benefits and there are dangers of every technology, right? Whether we have cars, if a drunk driver is driving around a car and killing people, that's not the car's fault. If the Chinese and Russians are making missiles which are AI enabled, it's not AI's fault. If we are misusing AI to change election results, it's not AI's fault, it's the people behind it, right? So I think in terms of the job and other areas, you made a very interesting point that efficiency creation leads to loss of jobs. So let me give a couple of examples which are kind of contrary to that, and just to show how AI also benefits while it does hamper a lot of jobs. So I'll give examples on both sides. So if you look at Ola and Uber, for example, today, right? And when we were at Ola, we used to talk to the drivers all the time and say, "How are you doing?" before and after Ola came. And Ola, you can think of it as a technology/AI company which brought efficiency into the cab fleet management system, right? What does that mean? It means that now more people are able to get the cabs, more drivers are able to get onto one of these platforms, right? So there is benefit in a two-sided marketplace, and that efficiency had led to increase in their incomes. It has led to more capacity in the taxi system in the country, and it has led to a better way of commuting and all that, and people don't have to buy cars and things like that, right? Another example I'll give is the new commerce idea that Reliance Retail is now trying to promote is that we are not going to sideline the Kirana stores, mom and pop stores. How can we actually bring them onto the AI bandwagon and digitize them so that they can do their inventory management better, their pricing better, their supply chain better with the help of technology, right? So if we think of technology as an enabler in some sense, and how do we bring technology to these people to make them more efficient and productive and and the whole ecosystem more efficient, right? Look at agriculture, for example. Today we don't know, what is grown where and when is it going to be available, and what is the demand supply of food in the country. But if we have satellites that can tell us what is growing where, when is it going to be available, we can actually increase the efficiency of our agriculture system, right? And we can match supply to demand. We can understand from retailers what is the demand. We can understand from satellite data what is the supply, and we can do that job very well, right? So there are a lot of possible benefits that AI can bring, which will actually increase the productivity and efficiency of people and systems. This is one part of the positive aspect of AI, right? So, and at the end, I will conclude that it's not AI per se, but the way we use AI that is going to decide what will happen to our society. Now the negative examples, right? So today, one of the things, sir, you brought up is these companies are using Indian workers the same way they were using Indian workers in the past for IT jobs, low level IT jobs, right? So one of the examples I'll give is in the AI economy, one of the very important areas is labeling the data. And today, if I look at all these, Fagma companies, they are actually using a lot of Indian labor, if you will, to label the data, right? So they show you an image and they say, label this. Is it a stop sign or a car or whatever? Now, that is a very important input that goes into their systems to train the deep learning models that they use to build autonomous vehicles for the whole world, right? Now, obviously, this labor force is not being recognized, right? They are, we have used the Indian labor market in this way in the AI economy now. So this is the negative aspect of it. And if we don't upskill ourselves, we are going to be continuously seen as the BPO country or the labeling country of the world, and not as a technology producer country. And that is one of the areas that is of grave concern, and that's why many, including the current Indian government, and many people are thinking about bringing up a new kind of education system that will help revamp the way we teach our next generation, so that they are at least prepared for this onslaught of the West in the technological excellence.
If you look at the last 30 years or so of office automation, it has given rise to what I like to call the point and click culture. Now, what has happened is that 30 years ago, people may fill out forms by hand or make phone calls. Today, almost everybody goes to the office, sits in front of a computer screen for the next 8 hours, and then they go home. And within those 8 hours, just to repeat my phrase, I call it point and click. They pull the cursor someplace, click, and do something. I don't see that changing. What AI will change is what happens behind the screen once you click. So I think people can adapt relatively easily to the advent of AI. The other very important point for me in terms of AI is, unlike many previous technologies, AI is almost completely open source. There are not that many proprietary technologies that somebody can wrap up, lock away, and keep anybody else from exploiting. So that means that even a high school student can sit and write a nice AI application for finding out the vegetable prices in the next Monday, as Shailesh was mentioning. The tools that are needed will be readily accessible. There is no issue about that. And the last point, of course, is the connectivity issue. And here I must say that Reliance has almost single-handedly transformed the landscape, whereby even middle school and high school children are able to get reasonably good bandwidth to get access to information. So therefore, if somebody does have an idea for an AI application, that person, the developer, need not worry whether the potential users of that application will have sufficient bandwidth to use it. Now, the one challenge in AI, as I see it now, is that it's a bit of a resource hog, not particularly efficient as things are. And so you see that it's only the very large companies with huge computing power that are creating these applications. And where countries like India can actually take the lead, and some are doing it, they are not the kind of people who McKinsey or Pricewaterhouse goes and interviews, as Mr. Malhotra rightly pointed out. These are these very bright entrepreneurial youngsters from schools and colleges around India. They're creating these edge computing AI applications, which are small enough to fit into portable devices with limited memory, limited battery life, and limited computing power. And I think that what we do in that domain, we can actually be the leaders. I think the lesson for people like us to learn from all this is don't try a top-down approach. I certainly don't want the government of India to come out with AI policy for the country, because that will be a disaster. Instead, facilitate open source tools, facilitate the creation of low-cost, high-bandwidth networks, facilitate language interfaces in all the Indian languages, and turn the people loose. That's what is going to happen in India, and that's definitely going to be more of a benefit than a hindrance. This is my belief.
Thank you, Gopi, for organizing this panel, and thank you, Dr. Malhotra, for bringing us all together to consider this very important question. And I do completely resonate with your summary that this is actually a wake-up call to action. And I particularly liked your dedication to young scientists and technocrats. Also, I do want to also mention that you are not using the word, Dr. Malhotra, in the narrow, limited technical sense of AI, but you also include actually the entire ecosystem of technologies that AI propels forward. For example, you mentioned quantum computing, semiconductors, nanotechnology, medical technology, aerospace, 5G, etc. Okay. For a long time, if you read the popular literature, people say that the agricultural revolution was a great leap forward for humanity. Okay, but there is this very interesting book by *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari, who says that that tale is fantasy. He says rather than heralding a new era of easy living, agricultural revolution left farmers with lives generally much more difficult and less satisfying than those of the foragers. The average farmer worked much harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. They broke their backs clearing fields, lugged heavy buckets from the well, and he goes on to say that we did not domesticate wheat, domesticated us apes. The question is, can we as humanity envision where we're going, and can we actually take action that is in our best interest, whatever that means? And that is not at all clear. For example, if you take this global climate change, we all know it is coming, right? Are we doing all the things that we can? It is not clear whether humanity can act intelligently. There is actually a broader issue also, as brought out in Thomas Piketty's book on capital, which also, says which also says that inequalities can generally do increase with time. Now, let me turn specifically to India. India has had a long tradition thinking deeply of the ethics of politics, the ethics of warfare, the ethics of administration, everything. To think about the ethical uses, ramifications of all these new technologies is something very much that India is well suited to do if we can just tap into, resonate with our natural philosophical inclinations. A lot of us, we just follow the bandwagon and do wherever our research or job takes us. But, we need to reflect more about where we're headed. As somebody said, life unexamined is not worth living. What maybe we should challenge ourselves more. For example, in the United States, when we write proposals, our National Science Foundation insists that we write a broader impact statement, a societal impact. And invariably, people talk about the positive impact of what they're writing. Maybe we should expressly ask people to also say what are the possible negative impacts and so on, just to warn people, caution people. At least it increases awareness. So when we write things, when we do research, maybe we ought to say something about possible negative uses, okay, along with the positive uses. Maybe we can even bring this down to PhD students. Maybe you can bring into practice some kind of oath for engineers and programmers and economists and so on. But more broadly, we do need a a much deeper education. Okay, I think that this problem is not going to be solved just by a few people. There has to be broad awareness in society, among school teachers, among children in middle school, elementary school, high school, etc. So we need much deeper courses on these kinds of issues. I just wish that we in India can somehow bring ourselves together to think rationally about these problems with in the Indian tradition, and think about what is it that is good for us, what is it that is bad, and act in a concerted way. Thank you.
I think we'll go to the second question. Again, I'm taking a phrase from the book. Disruptive AI technology will weaken many sovereign states and destabilize fragile political equilibriums. There is a realistic scenario for the recolonization of the world differently, that is, as digital colonies. I'd like to pose the question, is there a technology denial regime possible with AI as it happened with nuclear energy, especially if it is combined with advanced quantum systems and the like, or for example, AI and cyber warfare, or could there be an arms race through things like adversarial learning? Okay. Can I request Professor Vidyasagar to speak a few words on this?
The reason why I emphasize the fact that a lot of AI tools are open source is precisely for this reason. For example, even semiconductor design, like the chips, could be denied. The semiconductor chips could be denied under various regimes, but the code that is running on them, quite often is not going to be denied. And I think that the interfaces, many of those things are also in the open source. So I don't think it will be quite that easy to create a kind of a barrier to the free flow of AI tools. I think much more insidious is the point that Sri Malhotra mentioned in his opening remarks, which is that in the guise of democratizing AI, we could actually wind up with a surveillance state. And oftentimes, the pervasiveness of the surveillance tools can be sold as a boon rather than as a bane. So because some small incremental benefits will accrue from the surveillance mechanism, and people will perhaps be brainwashed into not seeing the much worse deleterious effect.
I think Rajivji wanted to pose a question. Can you kindly proceed?
Yeah, I have a comment. IBM's Watson is not available. We don't have a Geo Watson equivalent, or a Tata Consultancy, or a Infosys Watson. Now, nobody stopped it. There's no regime saying that it's banned, like in the case of nuclear. But the sheer magnitude of the technology, the hundreds of thousands of man hours, man years that went into it, the investment that went into it, then testing it in medical industry, banking industry, all kind of industries, perfecting it. This is a very large scale. In fact, it is so large scale, IBM is thinking of breaking up into two companies. The old IBM will become sort of low value company, maintaining software and stuff like that, mostly Indian programmers doing it. And the new IBM, which will have a large market cap, will be cloud and Watson together. That's it. So that's the future they see. Now, in the case of, there's another one called GPT-3, which started with a company that is OpenAI. Their name says that they are an open AI foundation, and their purpose is to not deny AI and make it open. And Elon Musk is one of the persons who backed it. However, in the last 2 months, the GPT-3 got licensed exclusively to Microsoft. Now, here is an open source developed in the pretext of being open to everybody. But just 2 months ago, GPT-3 got licensed to Microsoft. And I know this because my foundation is involved in an AI project. We are developing something we haven't announced, but we are developing an AI system, our own AI system, something to do with our civilization, and we need funding for it. And it's a very pioneering project. We were hoping to do it on GPT-3. And we hired somebody who's an expert on GPT-3, and he gave us this news that is no longer going to be very, very possible unless Microsoft gives you this permission, and Microsoft will, of course, make money out of it. So whether you take the example of GPT-3 in the hands of, for those who don't know, GPT-3 takes natural language processing, understands the meaning of words. You can use it for translation. You can compose things naturally. You can understand natural speech, whether it's messages, email, videos like this. They can figure out what you are saying, and it has a huge impact on using artificial intelligence. So whether it is Watson, which is being used in all kinds of vertical markets, or whether it is GPT-3, the point is that what is technically supposed to be open source, in practice it is not. It is not open source, because to be using it, you need a very large scale. You need to, and some of the technologies like GPT-3, even though the fundamental principles of AI are open source, one could say that the fundamental principles of nuclear physics are open source. But just because the principles of nuclear physics are open source doesn't mean that the engineering of implementing nuclear reactors was open source. So similarly, GPT-3 is not, I cannot go and get the source code of GPT-3 from Elon Musk. He won't, it's not available. And I cannot get the whole Watson either. So I think we have to, this business of AI is open source is also one of those things that a lot of Indians have bought into. And a lot of the media that is trying to placate people and not raise suspicions and not let people worry too much is going around saying everything is open source, don't worry. I mean, that's like saying nuclear physics is open source, and so there's no problem. So I think there is a problem. I think that what we will have will not be a denial of technology, but a technological imperialism. Technological imperialism means IBM will say, of course, everybody can use Watson, of course, but then you are the customer and they are the producer. They keep the data, you are the user, they make revenue out of it. So of course, Microsoft will say GPT-3, we make it available worldwide, but they are the owners. So when you have a producer-consumer relationship, it's not symmetric. It's not symmetric. When you have a supplier-buyer relationship, seller-buyer relationship, it's not symmetric. So it can be open source, but the people who are the producers, who are the sellers, are in a higher position than those who are the consumers and users. I mean, obviously, Britain didn't say that we won't sell you manufactured textiles. They want to sell you the manufactured textiles and make money off of it. So I think the direction we are headed in, when you look at Watson as an example, and when you look at GPT-3 as an example, the direction we're headed in is what I would call AI imperialism, which means it's available, it travels through national boundaries, but some people are more equal than others. Some people have more ownership in it and more power over it. Then take a look at data. Facebook and Google control a lot of things in India. They control that they will make my post viral, and maybe Gopinath will be blocked, or Gopinath's post will go viral. I'll be shadow banned, and this is happening. And we are talking to the Google representative in India or the Facebook representative in India to adjudicate and to argue that, hey, listen, I'm not a bad guy. I did not violate anything. He violated it. Now it's like the British East India Company adjudicating between one Raja and another Raja. Rajas going to the East India Company to prove their case as if they are the rulers, as if they are the gods. So in my book, I call them Google Devta, Facebook Devta, Twitter Devta. These are the Devatas that we have to go to get our right, our freedom, our equal status on the social media. So while technologically there's no ban, anybody can start this, anybody can start their own. In practice, the amount of big data these people have is huge. The effect of so many hundreds of millions of people being members and having friends and having invested there, there's an investment in building your community on Facebook. I could technologically leave and join another platform. But what will happen to my whole community? I won't leave if I'm alone in a new platform. And I cannot convince my thousands of people, millions of followers and people to go along with me. So this critical mass that these people have built is not very easy to replace and not very easy to migrate. So whether it is the kind of advantage, vertical industry advantage that Watson has, whether it is GPT-3 advantage in natural language processing with a huge amount of experience and algorithms that have learned, or whether it is the advantage that these big data companies in social media have. These are different kinds of advantages, all brought about by the use of AI. And therefore, I'm giving you 3 examples where it's not a level playing field. There is no ban, but it is not, the effect is that we are not on power. I cannot go to an India-based social media, get all the benefits of Facebook and Google, get all the same number of followers, the same number of viewers, exactly like Facebook and Google give me. There is none available. And I cannot go to a place where the adjudication is under Indian courts, where there would be somebody in India I could go to and protest and make a complaint and say, I'm not being fairly treated. They'll escalate it to a higher level, eventually it'll end up in the United States, and you will get nowhere. So I, based in the United States, face this. And so people based in India face it even more. I've had numerous fights with Facebook, me personally, and with YouTube. And it's so amazing. For arbitrary reasons, they send you a notice saying that this thing will not be allowed, that thing violates community standards. Brian, who's a technical guy behind the scenes organizing this conference call, this Zoom, he's the guy who contacts these people to argue with them, saying there's nothing wrong in this post. And the answer is, sir, we cannot do anything. The algorithm decided it. So now there is this algorithm devata also. And so just like in the traditional devatas, you need to know agamas, which give you all the rituals, how to please this devata, what you have to do. Now we have to learn the agamas for Google and agamas for Facebook in order to, which is called the rituals and the protocol and the etiquette and what you should do, the search engine optimization. All those are agamas for appeasing these new devatas. So I think that, and you will see this is a very serious part of what I call Battleground 3, which is the battle for minds, hacking our minds, using big data and machine learning to give them the advantage to hack our minds. And it is not symmetrical. Then you take facial recognition. Everybody can, of course, start the algorithm and start training it for facial recognition. But some people have the advantage of having done facial recognition on hundreds of millions of people of all kinds, all races, all ages. If I grow a beard, they can still recognize me. All of that. If I were to do a startup, I will not have that advantage of so much experience. And the people are able to, people are doing facial recognition of all your social media, so they can build your community, who you are friendly with, which politician you go out with, what affair you are having, who are your friends, who are your enemies, whom you haven't seen for many years, whom you've seen many times last week. All of that is being figured out. So the ability of the little guy, of course, technically anybody can do it, but practically it is not possible. So I really believe that there is an asymmetry of power. And in this asymmetry of power, the big guys are generally foreign-based, which takes me to the next point, which is I see the problem India faces is that all of this imperialism, AI imperialism, is apexed in United States and China. We've stopped the China, but we still got United States. And so, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with these guys, but India should have more agency, more freedom. And under this Make in India thing, we ought to be making our own platforms and building our own big data and having our own, equivalent of Watson and GPT-3. So that's how I take a look at it. It's to me, the theory is that, yes, it's all level playing field, but in practice, it's not so.
Yeah. Thanks, Rajiv. I'd like to, Professor P.R. Kumar would like to respond.
It is important for us to understand what is really difficult in India for India to do and what it is possible easily for India to do. And I'm going to take 2 examples. You cannot envision India entering the 20th century, 100 years ago, or passing through the 20th century without a steel mill, right? Now here we are in the 21st century in India without a single wafer fabrication, a good wafer fabrication plant. We have some stuff in Chandigarh and so on, but essentially zero. And it is unbelievable that we can be a modern country without a wafer fabrication plant. These are the steel mills of the future. Okay, that is really difficult for India to do because it takes a whole bunch of different technologies and so on. On the other hand, Dr. Malhotra, I would like to say that easier than that, much easier than that, is what we understand as machine learning, right? people, facial recognition, and so on. Any dedicated set of few people can put together fantastic database and all kinds of things they can do. That's not a problem. So on that kind of algorithmic software stuff, there is India can do it. If we don't do it, it's only because we somehow, for economic or organizational or whatever purposes, we're not doing it. It is possible. It is definitely within the realm of possible. It's definitely within the realm of possible for a bunch of professors from IISc or IIT or a bunch of people in the Bangalore ecosystem to develop Watson. It's not difficult.
So there are obviously, great asymmetries that are created by technology throughout human civilization, right? AI is just the latest example. But if you look at who colonized the world first, are the people who figured out how to go across the oceans, right? So technologies have always been, creators of asymmetry in the world, and colonization is one example of that, right? And now the digital colonization is a great example of what is going on. I'll give a couple of examples of how it is happening and why this facade of open source has been thrown upon us and we have started to believe it, right? So, there was a debate about data centers by all these companies in India, right? So today, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, obviously, if they don't bring data centers into India, today a lot of these applications in India, let's say Ola and even Flipkart for a long time, ran out of Amazon and other data centers which are sitting outside India, right? Now the debate came that, hey, these data centers have to come to India because Indian data cannot go out. And the kind of data centers we are seeing in India are actually third generation data centers. So the kind of technology that are being used in India to create data centers out of reluctance is a third generation data center, which is like 3 generations behind, if you will, right? If you look at GPU technology, CPU technology, Indian data centers by the same companies are way behind than what they have in even Singapore, right? Singapore data centers are far ahead than Indian data centers in Mumbai, Delhi, wherever they are, right? By these companies. So that's one example. And I think that leads to a question of whoever controls the entire value chain is going to win this, right? So if somebody controls the VLSI and manufacturing of VLSI and the design and manufacturing, that, India has lost to Intel and AMDs of the world. Then, the cloud and hardware, the PC revolution, we have not produced a Dell-like company to produce a PC. We have not produced a Microsoft-like software company to conquer that market. So hardware, VLSI, hardware, software, now data, and, again, the FANG companies are far ahead and all that. And now the AI market, right? So it's an entire value chain. We cannot see one without the other. And if you look at the entire value chain, anywhere somebody can cut us off, right? So if they decide to close the data centers, or like you said, China decides to not sell certain chips to India from Taiwan, then we are vulnerable to that. So I think, like we have tried to achieve sovereignty in food, we should also try to achieve sovereignty, end-to-end sovereignty in this also, right? In technology. The other point I wanted to make was this facade of open source, right? So I wonder, I was at Google and I work with the TensorFlow team, and they have open source Tensor. After I left and many things happened, they have open source Tensor. I thought it was a great gesture on part of Google. But I want to, debate this idea that all this TensorFlow is not useful without all the data that Googles of the world have. So I can have TensorFlow as a technology. I can use the free version of it and all that, but I don't have the kind of data they have. And the only reason why a company would open source something is not because they want to open source something, but because they know that you cannot do anything with that. You cannot become a competitor to them. So I'll give you one more example. Twitter, back in the day, Twitter had opened up its data, right? So Twitter said anybody can download a lot of Twitter data and do analytics on it. And as soon as they realized that there's a lot of value to their data, they closed it, right? So while every company wants to be very philanthropic, open source and all that, as soon as they realize the value of their technology, they try to become a lot more closed about it. So, and this is yet to be seen in this world also. But I think the spirit with which the internet started, for example, and the spirit with which Google was started is lost somewhere. And now we are living in a different kind of internet, and Google and all these technology companies, with the spirit with which Facebook started and now what it is has evolved in a very negative direction. And I completely agree with Rajiv sir that that churning and manthan has to happen, and what how it will affect India is a very important question that all of us have to think about.
Thank you, Shailesh Kumar. I think Rajiv wants to respond to some of the issues raised so far.
Thank you very much. So, I think this is a phenomenal discussion. This is really amazing. It's going well beyond what I wanted. It's really great. Now, the good news is, Shailesh is so candid as a corporate guy, so candid about the challenges facing the corporate world. I mean, I was concerned he may be defensive, but I'm so happy that he's looking at it from all sides of, he's looking at the corporate side, he's looking at it as an Indian, he's looking at it, what the limitations are. Because even in my book, I will confess, Shailesh, I've criticized that why aren't the people like Jio doing more? But I think you're valid in saying that the challenges are huge. It'll take time. I mean, we have to. So I'm also learning. I'm very glad you're updating my own knowledge also, because I was very critical that why did they let Google and Facebook in? Those guys are like the East India Company, and why is the Raja letting those guys in? You should be actually creating a Google of our own. But the point you're making is that this is not so easy. I mean, you have semiconductors, and then you have Dell to put it all together. We don't have any of that. Then you have Microsoft to write operating system. Now you have AI. Then you have big data. I mean, there's so many levels we don't have. Now, I disagree with Professor Kumar because I think he brings an academic view, which is not a practical industry view. There's a difference between what is theoretically possible and what's practical. It's theoretically possible, just like he says, it's also possible that you can get a few smart people and write the next operating system for Microsoft. And there's nothing special about iOS, and there's nothing special about Android, there's nothing special about Windows, we can also do it. But the point is we haven't done it. And it's not that easy. I'm an operating system guy. My first job in computer science in the early 70s was in the mainframe industry, writing operating systems, compilers, and those kind of things, database software, when these things were just starting out. And so I understand that, in those days, I could get a team of 50 people and we could write our own OS. But it is not so easy to make an OS, make it scalable, have an install base, have so many apps on it. I mean, when you look at it as an industry, as a corporate system, to achieve what these guys have achieved, the American companies, is not trivial. It's a very big deal. And the big data and the facial recognition is one thing to say that I'll get 5 guys in my lab and we'll write a facial, but that's not going to cut it. You will get 0.1% market share. That's really what it is. So the big things, I would even add quantum computing to that. I would say that we haven't mentioned that, but I would say like semiconductors, the concern the U.S. Department of Defense has, and I've talked to some people there, one of the big troubles that the U.S. thinks they are in is that China has stolen a lot of secrets. China is getting ahead in quantum computing. And if they were to have a breakthrough in quantum computing, they've had a few milestones, but if they need 1 or 2 more, they would be able to hack all the networks. They'll be able to, all the encryption will be gone, 64-bit or higher will be all gone. Passwords will be obsolete. And like that, you'll be able to, with one click, like Vidya Sagarji said, point and click. By just point and click, you'll be able to break through any code. And so the defense networks will be vulnerable. The only way to resist a quantum computing onslaught is to have your own quantum computing. So the race for quantum computing is a race for military supremacy. It is literally come down to that. The United States understands that. So don't think this trade war is because of some quirk that between President Xi and Trump and all that. This is all CIA, Department of Defense, Pentagon, serious thinking people are coming to the conclusion that we are in trouble as the United States. And India now understands it. They just TIFR just hired a person I know from Cambridge, whose doctorate was in quantum computing, to come and start some quantum computing work in India. So the layers and layers of technology, each of them requiring tens of billions of dollars in investment and many, many years of time. The layers are required to build a whole ecosystem to bring India on par with China and USA is huge. And, I mean, I really want the GOP type people, the government type people to scale this in a big way. But I also understand what Shailesh is saying. This is not easy. Let's not trivialize that a few of us will be able to manage this. One other thing I want to mention on the issue of sovereignty, which I think Shailesh mentioned, data sovereignty. It was either Vidyasagar or Shailesh, that we need sovereignty of our technology. I would like something the scale of ISRO or Bhabha Atomic Research to be put together for this field. Something of that size, something where it is, the scale is huge, the funding is huge, and that works with industry, that works with academics. We have a lot of little pockets because we think I can get 5-10 guys and I can put it all together. That's not so. The American might is the military industrial academic complex. It is not just Eisenhower called it the military industrial complex, but now academic has joined in. When I was a grad student in 1971, my professors in computer science, my professors all had government grants. I had to get security clearance with the Pentagon to go with my professor. And I felt so proud and so, fascinated that a young student like me is doing stuff that are funded by the Department of Defense. Now in India, you don't have that. You don't have large scale. I'm not talking about a little bit here and there. I'm talking about large scale projects funded by the Department of Defense and military, which have collaborations with industry, which have collaborations with academia. We don't have that. Academia is separate silo. Industry is separate silo. You don't even have academic industry alliances on the same scale as in the United States. Defense industry are also separate. So there are 3 separate silos in India. Whereas in China also, China has taken the American model. And China has the military, industrial, academic complex. The Jack Ma is having problem with the Chinese government. They're suing him for antitrust and all that. It's all to get him back online because the People's Liberation Army has a huge stake in Jack Ma's thinking and his funding and control. And every time he goes a bit off, they want to pull him back. And so China has taken this American model that the government funds a lot of things on a very big scale, and industry is part of it. And which is, the capitalist free market system, but they're part of all this. And so is the academic world. In the United States, all this Grumman and, all these Northrop and Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and all these huge defense contractors, that's the backbone of the US defense R&D. And that also is a kind of segue into the private sector. They get a lot of technology from defense contracts, and then they privatize it and make money out of it ahead of other countries. So this, I think, is a topic to discuss, the lack of industrial, military, academic complex in India.
Thank you, Rajiv. Professor P.R. Kumar?
So first, actually, I should say that I completely agree with Dr. Malhotra. At all levels, but what I'm trying to do is introduce a little bit of nuance. For example, there was in 2002, there was a bunch of people at IISc who developed the Simputer. This was way ahead of its time. It was right there with Palm, ahead of Palm, and but it didn't take off. Okay, so we developed the operating system for this handheld device, etc., but it didn't take off. The question is why? What are the challenges that prevented that from becoming a dominating product?
Yes.
Those challenges are very different from, for example, the challenges of starting a fabrication plant in India, where you need $5 billion a pop. Okay, and there are other challenges. For example, 5G in India. Until recently, it turns out that there is this organization called 3GPP, which is developing the standards for the 5G technology. Okay, and at this place, all countries have a if they just insist, they have a place at the table and they can veto things. You have a veto power. Until recently, India played no role in that organization, and through the efforts of a bunch of people, mainly from academia. Okay, India has a standards organization. Okay, TSDSI, Telecom Standards Development Society of India. There also we've had challenges. It turns out that the Indian when they set up this society, standard society, invited all companies which are registered in India to be members. And of course, you have a lot of foreign companies which have set up Indian things. It has been very difficult to get that going. So the challenges of how you can get 5G technology done in India are very different again from say how you can develop a jet engine. So we have different challenges at different levels, and if I and I think all of them are difficult. But if I had to kind of think about what scares me more is when will India ever get a semiconductor wafer fabrication plant? The only hope there is one small silver lining. There are some things even in semiconductors which are like leapfrog technologies. Maybe we should just go to set up a small fab in gallium nitride or something like that, lighting technologies, where the capital cost is not that much. And in fact, this was mentioned to me by a professor at ISC, Professor Navkant Bhatt. So maybe with a smaller capital, we can get a semiconductor thing started in India ahead of its time. So I guess the point I'm saying is there are some things that technologically we can do, but somehow the rest of the Indian ecosystem is not allowing that. There are other things which are technologically also very difficult.
So can I request Professor Vidyasagar to respond to some of the comments?
So I think we need to make a distinction between what I'll call self-sufficiency, so that someone cannot put you out of business through technology denial regime. I feel reasonably comfortable on that. But whether we will actually achieve a position of technological leadership so that in addition to being self-sufficient, we also become world leaders, that's much more iffy. I think that Kumar's idea of a gallium arsenide foundry as opposed to silicon foundry is a very good one. Whether there's a master plan in India as there is in, say, a country like China, no, there isn't. And quite frankly, given the state of the Indian politicians, there is never going to be. I think we should stop counting on having wise politicians and wise bureaucrats who put the interests of the country ahead of their own self-interest. It's not going to happen.
The next question is, how is AI shifting power between individuals and large organizations, whether private or government? In the United States, the big five, for example, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, etc., they collect large amounts of behavioral data. And the US state is mostly in partnership with these private players. In China, the state is moving from a totalitarian model to an AI-based surveillance model. So the question I'd like to pose is, if you notice in the 90s, we had World Trade Organization, GATT, with respect to goods and IPR. IPR rules have been mostly code-centric, not data-centric, while now data has become very important. So will it be the case that the global AI powers, will they change international laws, for example, with respect to data, for their own advantage? And what is happening in India, for example? For example, we don't have any platforms at the, let's say at the private level typically, except at the government level. For example, we have something called the India Stack, GST, JAM, that is Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile. Now there's also a new one called Open Credit Enablement Network, okay? OCEN, okay? So these are the kind of platforms that are beginning to become available, but these are all at the government level. So in terms of AI, all these platforms, can they be, let's say, are they usable? What is the long-term prognosis? So essentially, I'm asking the questions about shifting of power between individuals and large organizations, and issues about, for example, global powers, will they change these international laws to their advantage? And what is happening with respect to India with respect to platforms? So can I request Sailesh to first make his remarks, then we will request Professor Vidyasagar and Kumar to, and then conclude with Rajiv's observations.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a great question. And so the, I think if I look at the historical perspective, right, since the independence till, let's say, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I think we have had a very slow start. We have not had strategic thinking about how to take the country forward. We have not had a holistic thinking around technology. We were still dealing with, hey, we are coming out of a lower middle class, poor country mindset, and put a, poverty line, and we were having those discussions while the rest of the world was having discussions about AI. We were having discussions about food security and all that, right? So obviously we are behind. It looks very pessimistic, but I'm very hopeful with the same technologies, the internet, and all that. Now the Indian youth is much more aware. We are studying from the best universities of the world, and we are absorbing all that great knowledge. So now that that one level of equilibrium has come, democratization of education has happened, at least, and now it is up to us to adopt that revolution and do something beyond it, right? But if you think about shifting of power again, I keep talking about whenever this question arises, right? Will AI destroy humanity? Will AI create disequilibrium? Will AI do this? Will AI take away jobs? I think at a very philosophy level, human civilization has not moved ahead on the inner self, and it has moved very fast on the outer self. And that is the true imbalance that we have to worry about.
Basically, I was asking one specific question about
Yes.
the lack of Indian platforms,
Yes.
except at the government level. Okay, at the government level, we have something like India Stack, GST,
Yes.
JAM, and OSIN, etc. So, in terms of AI, what is likely to happen in these areas, and especially the shifting of power between individuals and world organizations?
Yes. And I think as long as we remain tactical thinkers, we will never become platform thinkers. And this is what is one big lesson we have to learn here, which is if we don't think platform, and these platforms are great. I think, the payment, digital payment, and the digital, Aadhaar and all that, these are amazing, very, very strategic. And the next platform, the national education policy, these are very, very far reaching initiatives by the government. Um, and it is unfortunate that industries did not think about these platforms, right? It took a government or some other body or a neutral agency to think about these platforms. And that is what I think is lacking, which is we need such platforms because they are the foundations to do the next layer and the next layer and the next layer, right? And I think the more such platforms we can create, the more we can digitize the Indian economy, the Indian society, the Indian culture, and bring those benefits. But platformization thinking has always been lacking because that is a strategic thinking that takes time, research, money, and like Dr. Malhotra was saying, the it takes an ecosystem to build such things, right? We cannot do it as a startup. It takes a huge amount of resources and people and a lot of political will or an industrial will or a technological will or an academic will to come together to build such platforms. And I think that is the part that we are lacking, and we need to start thinking that, are we going to remain a billion India or one India, which is kind of focusing on building such platforms together. One of my key learnings is that I think India will definitely benefit from AI, but AI will benefit a lot from India. And if you think about this dictum, AI will benefit a lot from India. I think, let me give some examples, right? So I keep thinking about the AI stack for India, right? You asked the stack question, the platform question. And, India has one of the largest diversity of data in any field, whether it is speech, whether it is language, whether it is genomics, whether it is consumer behavior. I think we are the gold mine of data. And if we are ourselves not able to take advantage of it, then we have failed. So first is we have to recognize that as a playing field for AI, right? Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, India is one of the richest data generators, if you will, possible, right? If you go to France, there is one language. If you go to Germany, there is one language. If you go to US, there is only one language. In India, we have 22 official languages and so many more dialects and other things behind it, right? Can we do GPT-3 in Indian languages? We have only done it in English after so much of hard work and data and compute. Can we do such things in Indian languages? Can we build translation systems across Indian languages which are needed? Can we build speech to text understanding systems so that our drivers can speak in the local language and talk to their devices in a noisy environment, sitting in an Ola cab, right? So what I'm trying to do is, whenever I talk to the next generation data scientists, I turn their attention to the Indian opportunity in AI, right? And that's a huge opportunity, right? We don't always have to go and join a McKinsey or like a stock trading company and say AI for stock market, right? That's not always the best use case. Today, I think the use cases of AI in the Indian context are far richer, far more complex. And we have to recognize that, and the next generation of India has to recognize that. And when we learn data science, I think one of the things we are trying to do is we are trying to do it in a way which is problem centric first, right? Design thinking first. Go figure out the problems of India, right? There are potholes, there are farmers committing suicide, there is electricity problem, water problem, pollution problem in Delhi. Go figure out those problems. You don't have to go outside India to find what you need to do. So I think the first thing is we need to kind of educate ourselves about the opportunity of AI in the Indian context, and then think about what an Indian AI stack should look like. It is very important to realize that whenever we say natural language processing, everybody believes that it is English language processing. Nobody thinks it's a Sanskrit language processing or a Punjabi language processing, right? Why is that? It's not even in our minds. We never even think about it. We say NLP means chalo English mein kuch karenge, right? And this idea has to change, that India has a lot more opportunity. What you've done in one language, you can do it 20 times more in the Indian context. But where is the data? Where are the labels? Where is the parallel corpus? And now we have to work on those, because Google has not become Google because suddenly one day it became Google, right? It worked on it. Similarly, we have to work on it and organize ourselves around these ideas and say, look, we are rich in problem statements. We don't have to go out of the country to find problem statements. Let us become passionate about our own problem statements. And a few weeks ago or a few days ago, Google launched this language technologies for 7-8 Indian languages, right? It took a Google to actually launch Indian language systems, and we failed again in some sense, right? India has not done that.
Rajiv ji wanted to say something.
I'm really resonating with what Shailesh says. And my book is a critique of the way things are, not how they ought to be. And I agree with him on how they ought to be. The bottom up is what he's saying, and I agree with it. We need people to go to the village level, to the district level, to the panchayat level, and really understand India. And the problems are not uniform all over India. It's like a microcosm of the whole world. So we need our young people to go and discover this, hang out with NGOs, hang out with all sorts of local communities, jatis, profession-specific community, understand their problems and come up with solutions. Whereas too much has been going on based on top-down, foreign AI imported, big corporate thinking, all the reports which the government of India is using, they're getting all these McKinsey people, Google people to tell them what the strategy should be. So that is what I'm calling recolonization of India, because we are allowing other countries to define what we should do, how we should do it, even give us our funding. Majority of the funding for AI startups is foreign venture capitalist people. Even China got a lot more investment in India prior to all this blockage than the Indian companies did. Some of the Chinese companies are investing through Singapore and European holding companies and so on. So the AI is not neither the topics to discuss, the problems to solve are not developed bottom up, and the institutional mechanisms are not there. We are basically supplying labor. That's all we are doing, and the whole policy, if you look at the policy today, official policy of the government, official policy of many Indian institutions, NASSCOM, which is representing the software people, has basically conceded that we will just be laborers below the glass ceiling, and we're just going to skill so that this guy will buy it. Kotak, Uday Kotak, I quote him in my book, in this book that we're discussing, says that my dream is that just like urban India, boys are hired in Microsoft, and he gives these names. So also my dream is that rural India will also be working for those guys. And I quote him there. I say, what a lousy dream. That is not my dream of India. I mean, my dream is completely opposite. So I'm very glad that Shailesh while being a corporate guy, is able to think beyond this top-down limitation as a true Bharati. I'm so happy. Now, one point I want to comment on that Shailesh said, it is not AI or technology that is good or bad, but human beings. So when we evaluate the impact of AI on society, we are evaluating what are human beings likely to do with it. We are evaluating the human beings only. So there's a difference between what is and what ought to be. Terrorism as an application of various things happening in technology and globalization, not how it ought to be, but that's how it is. So when you take a pragmatic view, not an idealistic view of AI, then you have to look at how human beings are using it and how they're likely to use it. And that's how I've written this book as a pragmatic forecast and concern on the way things are turning out in AI, and not how I would say from a dharma point of view, how they ought to be. I'm also writing a sequel on how they ought to be, and my own proposal on how to turn it from what is to what ought to be. So that to me, they're two separate issues.
I think Professor Kumar wanted to say something.
In India, I think there is generally not broad awareness of many of the issues that we're talking about. Yes. For example, I'll give you some specific examples. For example, in 1987, the CDOT in India developed a rural telephone exchange, which unleashed a rural telecom revolution in India. At that time, CDOT was at the same level as Huawei. They were hot on the heels of 5ESS, the same telephone exchange that Bell Labs was using. Nevertheless, that company folded. What combination of economic forces, political interactions, etc., is dirty, dark secrets that are not discussed. Okay, people do not know. I think we need educating the public. I'll give you another example. We are discussing here, for example, in the 5G standards that are being set up, for the rural standards, they wanted to define standards that would be applicable to rural Europe or something, where you have very high-speed trains moving with propagation distances and so on, which may not be applicable to the Indian standards. There was a big battle led by people in India, IIT Madras and so on, where we put rural Indian standards into the standards. So we buy equipment that's more suitable for us. Same thing. We have actually 4G technology that has been developed in India, but they cannot test it out in a single cell. And there's a chicken and egg situation. Unless you test it in a single cell, nobody will buy it, and nobody will buy it unless you So how do you break that? And the government could easily have facilitated that. For example, we are setting up a BharatNet in India, where we're connecting fiber to all the Indian villages. Now we are connecting Wi-Fi hotspots to the ends of those fibers. It could have been very easy to try out a few of our 4G solutions. We didn't do that. And in fact, Wi-Fi has only a limited range, 30 meters, 50 meters, whereas a 4G station would have covered the entire, from the Gram Panchayat, the whole village. We didn't do that. Why? What are the issues there? The other issue, where are our IIT graduates going? I did a review of one of the major IITs a few years ago, and the statistics sometimes are shocking. How many of the IIT students aspire to becoming a clerk in a bank, in a foreign bank, is just depressing. These are all technological stories that have to be told to India. We will not get policy in India unless there is broad awareness. If you believe in a democracy, and that's where we are going now, there is not a central leadership which is going to take policy decisions without broad awareness. So I would like to suggest that every newspaper should have a technology column, daily, weekly, whatever. And they should discuss these very substantial examples, which are secrets, which are unknown to everybody in India, to talk what are the cutting edge issues in 5G, what is the policy for doing a leapfrog in semiconductor technology, etc., data centers, etc. So I think this is something very badly needed, and unless we educate our people about it, India is not going to get its act together. And it's very high time we got its act together, because even when we have been successful with the technology, we have given it up, like CDOT, for example. So I don't know how to facilitate that, but perhaps Dr. Malhotra through his Facebook or whatever can somehow unleash some magic here.
We had a very long discussion, but very interesting one. And I think probably it's time to close. So I'd like to request Rajiv ji to say the last few words, and then we'll close.
I want to thank everyone for making this a wonderful experience. I'm sure the viewers will love it. This is a very distinguished panel. Each one had their own views, and Gopinath managed it brilliantly. I want to say that throughout the year 2021, we plan on having many such events, virtual events, panel discussions. We want to have conferences, seminars. We're looking for partners, corporate partners, academic partners, partners of various kinds. And we want to open the discourse. Now, when I wrote this book, and I've been researching this for 4 or 5 years now, I thought that this will capture the imagination of social scientists. And I must tell you, I'm disappointed. It's not that I'm biased because I'm a technocrat myself and I'm biased, but I will tell you that the technocrats have taken this up as a serious matter, where they think it's very serious stuff. They understand it, and they feel that these are issues that ought to be discussed publicly. These are issues they've been talking about privately, but they need to come out more publicly. I feel that the policymakers are a little behind, but the most disappointing people are social scientists, psychologists, people who claim to have built careers in social psychology. I went to Delhi University, I went to various universities, JNU, I went to places like that, and I brought in social scientists. I thought that, okay, the old ones are very stuck in their ways and they're threatened by this. I showed them how the social sciences method of collecting data is obsolete. Anthropology is obsolete because now you can capture this data so much more easily, quickly, and you can process it in much better ways, that all these social sciences and all that are obsolete. Market research is already being taken over by AI. So they didn't get it. And then I thought maybe I'll go to younger people. I'll go to the younger professors. And they didn't get it. I thought I'll go to the postdoc people. So somehow the social sciences people in India are just not getting this. And this is one of the things I want to do with this book, is to break open into that. I feel that there are people in the United States in social sciences who are getting it. In economics, some 2 or 3 extremely well-known, publicly known economists in India, big figures. I sent them a little bit, about a year ago, what I was writing. They didn't understand. And they said things like, I'm an economist, why should I be worrying about AI? So I said, that's as ridiculous as somebody during the Industrial Revolution saying, why should an economist worry about Industrial Revolution? I mean, come on, it changed the whole world economy. And so AI is having such a huge impact. And you as an economist, you're telling me. And I'm talking about people who are in very senior positions, official positions, as economists, not bothered, as gurus, not bothered about the social discussions that ought to happen. I'm talking about public intellectuals who are in all these, forums and manthans, and they're having all these lit fests. Not a single panel on artificial intelligence, and I've been proposing it for a year. It's not like I haven't. I've been going to, whether it's the Jaipur Literary Festival, whether it is this one, that one, all kind of things. Left wing, right wing, they just don't know. They just don't think it's important. So part of the help I will need from you guys who are knowledgeable on this panel is I want to take it further. I want your help. I want to come back to you and propose. We are going to, as Infinity Foundation, we are going to develop many such things, and we want you involved as academic directors, as thought leaders, as panel leaders, because throughout 2021, this is what I want to be doing. So I want to close by thanking all of you, and by also saying that the mobilization of awareness building has just started. India is lagging behind not only in AI technology, but also in public awareness about these things. So with your help, let's move forward. And thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much, all of you. Again, it was a fantastic discussion. I think it has gone on for much longer than expected, but I'm deeply thankful that all of you stayed back so that we could conclude these discussions. And I think, as Rajiv has mentioned, we probably can, in case it is of interest, we can revisit other questions or more deeper questions, or if it is needed, we can certainly do it again. I think probably we will take the call by discussions.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you,
Anybody
everybody.
else wants to? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.